Hey everybody, I'm Zoe.
And I'm Chandi.
And this is Bound by the Cloak. Beverly Hills is a city known for its stately homes and famous residents. Many flock to the city for sightseeing tours, dining, and shopping on Rodeo Drive. Some try and catch a glimpse of Hollywood celebrities if they can. For us, as well as many of you, the idea of Beverly Hills conjures up thoughts and images of old Hollywood, the era of luxury and glamour of old film stars that we now only experience through watching old films or interviews. It truly was a different time.
There's another side to Beverly Hills, though, that is much darker, much more of a mystery. Just like with any place and time in history, there's good and bad. One thing we've learned over the years is that there will always be crime in some way, shape, or form. Beverly Hills is no different. Our guest today is Scott Huver, a prolific entertainment journalist in Hollywood, and the author of his latest book, Beverly Hills Noir: Crime, Sin, and Scandal in 90210. Hi, Scott. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So can you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Scott Huver. I'm a journalist and an author. I work primarily in the world of celebrity and entertainment reporting. I write for a lot of outlets like People Magazine and the trade papers Variety, Hollywood Reporter, Deadline. I've written for Vulture, InStyle, TV Guide, you name it. I've been doing it for a while. And I'm here also as an author with a book coming out, a true crime book called Beverly Hills Noir, which is a collection, sort of deep dives into several true crime cases from throughout the history of Beverly Hills, where I started my journalism career.
Awesome, and we read the book. I love the book.
Thank you.
Chandi.
Yeah. I did.
Other shoe's going to drop here. What?
Yeah.
We were wondering what inspired you to write the book and why focus on Beverly Hills specifically?
So when I first moved to Los Angeles in 1994, perhaps by coincidence, perhaps by fate, the first week that I lived here, I didn't have use of my car and I didn't have a job. So I was stuck at home, and it was at the height of the O.J. Simpson murder case having just happened. And I was at home during the day when O.J. was supposed to turn himself in, and said, oh, I'll watch that on TV. That'll be something to do over lunch. And as I watched it, it started to unfold into this incredible saga of the Bronco chase down the 405 freeway. I, at the time, lived a block from the 405, and as I'm watching it on TV, I started to recognize some familiar landmarks and said, oh, I think OJ's about to come through the neighborhood. Looked out the window, saw the helicopters, saw people lining the freeway. I was on the second floor, so I had a good view. And then next thing you know, here comes the Bronco with OJ and Al Collins, his buddy, in the infamous slow speed chase.
That's crazy.
And called my parents back in Michigan and asked, are you watching this? And they said, yeah. And I'm like, okay, well, wait for it. There's my new apartment. And they said, you're moving back. And I'm like, oh no, this place just got that much more interesting.
Oh, yeah.
Within another week, I think, a week or two, I had gotten my first job in LA working at a local newspaper in Beverly Hills. And part of my duties was to report on the crime beat. And in the 90s, crime was kind of in a similar place as it is today. It was definitely in an uptick. There was definitely more violent crime going on. And then the OJ case was hanging over all of the city. So there was just a kind of electricity around true crime, at least locally. And then on TV, things that happened. The Menendez brothers, which was a Beverly Hills case. Heidi Fleiss, which was a Beverly Hills case. Lots of scandals giving birth to court TV. So it was a moment in time. And I got very interested in the police beat, even though I never covered anything that serious before. And maybe because of that, I had taken it very seriously and didn't want to screw it up, because I was a guy who just liked to write about TV shows and movie stars and things like that. And so anyway, I formed a really nice relationship with the police, who at the time where I started, they were pretty distrusting of the local paper because of some past political history, but built a good solid foundation with them. And then as I was there for a few years, I got really interested in looking back at local history as well, and especially where those two things converged. And I became aware of how many flat out bizarre cases, famous and otherwise, that had taken place in Beverly Hills. And so I started kind of amassing them and familiarizing myself with them. And I'd write about them in the newspaper here or there. worked after I left that paper. I worked for another newspaper in Beverly Hills. I worked with the Rodeo Drive stores to publish a promotional magazine. So for many years, I had a strong hand and feet firmly in Beverly Hills. And then as I segued into entertainment, there's always that kind of bleed over too, especially when you're working with outlets like People that cover that sort of thing. So it became a bit of a hobby to keep kind of researching these stories because I was so fascinated by them. And that went on for many years. And I'm like, I always knew I wanted to do a book. And then for better or for worse, the pandemic made it happen. I finally had time on my hands and was able to get these things on paper and then get the book sold.
And there's so many interesting cases in Beverly Hills. And, you talk about some of them in your book. How did you choose which ones to include?
I really had an abundance of riches, as is appropriate for Beverly Hills, when it came to crime stories. I could probably write 4 or 5 books. What I wanted to do was get really in depth into the stories because the minutia is just as fascinating as the basic facts. There's celebrity cameos left and right. There's just opulent wealth and Hollywood adjacent and all kinds of things. So what I wanted to do is get a collection of stories that reflected all kinds of crimes. I didn't want to just focus on one type. Like I didn't want to just be murder. And I wanted something from multiple time periods just to kind of give it that each one kind of comes at things with a different tone and setting, even though Beverly Hills is what unifies all the stories. And Beverly Hills is an interesting kind of constant because it was always a city of the wealthy and pretty early on a city of the famous. That unifying factor helped me tell a lot of different kinds of stories. Now, I will say I wrote almost twice as many stories as I could fit in the book and still had that kind of variety, which was nice. And it did show me that, yeah, I could keep going if there's a readership for this. I've got plenty of stories to tell. So zeroing in on the ones that I did, I wanted to avoid ones that either were incredibly complex and long, like the Menendez brothers, or stories that had been told often, like Lana Turner, Johnny Stompanato from the 50s. As much as I really love both of those stories and do want to tell them at some point, I just wanted to kind of hit you with either some stories that were huge sensations in their time or involved very famous people or were flash in the pans where they were big headline makers when they happened, but are long forgotten. So I had to start with the first really sensational crime in Beverly Hills, which is the murder-suicide at Greystone Mansion, which is somewhat famous and has been written about, but I really wanted to write it through the lens of Beverly Hills and through the lens of this district attorney's investigator, Leslie White, who is the Jake Giddies of Chinatown in this story. He's the guy who knows the truth, but has to face what the world around him is making him do. So then it was just the variety. I love the story of the cat burglar, Gerard Graham Dennis. That's been a fascinating story for me forever. I'm a big Sinatra, Dean Martin fan and could not resist doing the Rat Pack story. The love triangle shooting between the producer, Walter Wanger, his actress wife, Joan Bennett, and her agent, Jennings Lang, is just juicy as hell and kind of morbidly funny. The story of the hostage situation in the Van Cleef & Arpels boutique on Rodeo Drive in the 80s was a very horrific story set against this sort of over-the-top opulent background. It's a story that probably the darkest, and I did want to go dark, really dark in at least one of the stories. And then the Winona Ryder story, the shoplifting trial, I was there, and that gave it a special flavor for me to remember. And I had really found all my old notes from that time period. So that was something I wanted to do. And then a bunch of stories that I worked on that weren't necessarily big sensations even at their time, but they're just so weird and so only in Beverly Hills. And they had this unifying theme of somebody pretending to be something they aren't, which is all too common in Beverly Hills and LA and Hollywood. So those are kind of how I settled on the ones we end up with in the book.
It's kind of refreshing to learn about crimes and cases that nowadays we really don't discuss much or know much about, because then it's not just the same old stories. It's a lot of information about something that's kind of new to people that don't know about either these celebrities or these people involved too. Because these are decades ago, some of these. I always like to learn more about old Hollywood, especially, the things you really don't know much about. And like I said, you went into a lot of detail in these cases. So how did you get all this information? How did you do your research? Like, who did you have to track down to get all this info?
It was a challenge. I had the advantage of having this be, as I said, kind of a hobby. And I had time to amass a lot of research, but I also had to crash a lot of research when the book became a reality. I was lucky in that with that time, I at least knew where to look. I had limits on what I could do because I had a window to meet my deadline. So I couldn't interview 100 people for each case. In many cases, I had to go with what either I knew from what happened, experiences I'd had, because I just didn't have the time to tell all these stories and with that. But they were all so reported on in their day and subsequently in many cases that there was more than enough information. And I think probably the best compliment I've gotten is that somebody said that it felt like you're in the room in many of these stories. And that was what I wanted to get to, because these rooms are extraordinary in and of themselves half the time. And I wanted to really, whatever the era, I wanted the reader to feel like they were right there and not just ticking off the highlights of a story, but really putting you in there. And I think I also was at a point in my life where I'm like, I didn't just want it to be black and white, good and bad. This person was evil. I wanted to understand why somebody might have done something horrible or out of character or something that made sense to them, but not to anybody else. So that was fun, really digging into what the psyches were, what was motivating these different acts. In some cases, you can't get there. You have to guess. You have to kind of put the facts out there that you know, and let the reader kind of follow the path that they want to follow. The first story, the Greystone Mansion story, was almost 100 years ago that took place, and we still don't know. There's no definitive answer, and we're probably not going to ever find out much more than what is out there. So that's interesting to me, like that there's a couple different ways to think that it might have happened, but there's also a lot of gray area in there.
And honestly, that really is the best way to think about it. I was trying to think of how to sum it up, which is, reading your book, you do feel like you're there. You really feel like you're in the Greystone Mansion, just kind of in the background, watching this unfold. I love it. That's fascinating.
What's interesting too is a lot of the locations are still around, and I've had the opportunity to actually be there, Greystone being one of them. I've been inside Greystone a handful of times over the last 30 years, but I've been in the murder room. I've been in the bowling alley that I talk about where Paul Thomas Anderson shot There Will Be Blood, a critical scene for There Will Be Blood there. I've been to the Beverly Hills Hotel, and I've got 8 zillion books around here that I can see what something looked like in a given era. If I was there in the 90s, 2000s, 2010s, now I can look back at this point and find some references to see what it looked like in the 50s. Sometimes it's exactly the same. Sometimes I see how it's been modified, tweaked, completely revamped. But that's another sort of fascination for me. It's like Beverly Hills isn't frozen in time, but there's a lot of pathways back into history that still stand.
Seems like it's a really unique part of Hollywood. In terms of the culture of Beverly Hills, how do you think that influences the types of crimes and scandals that happen there?
As I mentioned at the beginning, Beverly Hills has always been a city of wealthy people. The Beverly Hills Hotel, that iconic pink luxury hotel on Sunset Boulevard, was built to lure wealthy people to buy land in Beverly Hills. It was set right between downtown Los Angeles and the Pacific Ocean, and people driving, in their early cars or however they were getting to the beach, they needed a place to stay over and have the sort of luxury that they were accustomed to. And so the landowners around there, being very smart after they didn't find oil there, said, well, let's sell this as a sort of bucolic landscape for wealthy people to have these kind of opulent homes in this sort of still burgeoning area. It had been a cattle ranch for many years prior, a Spanish ranchero. And now it was a master planned city built around the hotel. Beverly Hills is very much a grid, which is rare for a city as old as it is. It was, the hotel came around in 1912. The city was official in 1914. So it's always had this patina of wealth. Movie stars came in the 20s. Douglas Fairbanks led the path because Hollywood itself, the physical, geographic location of Hollywood, was becoming sort of synonymous with scandal. And they were trying to get away from that. And so when Douglas Fairbanks set up a little hunting lodge and made it very, elite and very posh for a hunting lodge, it kind of took off with the other people in Hollywood, the movie moguls and people with money, and they started to all migrate into Beverly Hills and follow Fairbanks' example. And then once that happened, then captains of industry and visiting royalty and all these people, Beverly Hills became this very chic address on the west side of Los Angeles as it was very, very first coming up. So over the years, it has maintained this, very rare patina of wealth and power and privilege and fame that the city's residents, being mostly show folk at times, have burnished. Will Rogers, when he lived there, wrote a column in the newspapers, and he always datelined it Beverly Hills and talked about his famous neighbors. That cemented it in the culture. Jack Benny did his fictional Jack Benny self on his TV show as living in Beverly Hills, as Jack Benny did, and did stories about the police department where they had the police dogs were poodles and there were chandeliers in the front office of the police department. The Beverly Hillbillies made that hugely pop culturally relevant. Beverly Hills 90210. The rise of Rodeo Drive was part of every daytime talk show and game show in the 70s. Reinforced by Pretty Woman. So the image of all of this abundance in Beverly Hills has been consistent, and it can't help but draw in people who are like, I want that for myself, and I'll either earn it or I'll borrow it until I have it, or I'll just take it. and that is the story. And of course, some people that are already in Beverly Hills are not the nicest people either. You're always going to get criminals who have money, people who have criminal impulses and instincts that do bad things. And so that mix has always, been there. Gangsters like Bugsy Siegel lived in Beverly Hills. The cops had to walk a really interesting line back then because it was such a fat target and has remained so. LA was very famously corrupt in its police department. The mobs warred over LA for years, and no one mob ever won it over as they did in cities like New York and Chicago. Beverly Hills was always under scrutiny because there were so many attorneys who lived it, people with money who could bring pressure down on the police department one way or another. So they had to walk the same kind of fine line that all police departments are walking now. Beverly Hills was doing back in the 40s and 50s. It's not to say that they didn't have their way of doing things and their way of protecting their own residents, but they had to do it a little more carefully than a lot of other police departments did. That added even more drama to these stories is how were the police going to handle it? Because any misstep was going to be spotted by somebody and complained about loudly.
Yeah, that's something that I don't think I ever thought about, was that element of the police having to walk a fine line back then. When I think of old Hollywood, I don't really think of crime that much, right? I just think of old film stars. But yeah, I guess that really is an element that is part of it. And so, I guess I wonder, what is the most surprising and shocking thing that you've learned out of any of the cases that you've researched?
Oh, that's a good one. I think, number one, how hard it is to be a law enforcement organization in the white hot spotlight all the time. And Beverly Hills has been unique in finding ways to almost live with that, encourage it, take advantage of it by leaning into their own sort of celebrity status. You think of it like, it didn't get invented with Beverly Hills Cop and Eddie Murphy. You go and look at newspapers and magazines from the 40s and 50s, and you see profiles on the Beverly Hills Police Department and how they were known at any era for handling very famous, very delicate cases. And by and large, they're a small town community. For many years, it's a little different now, even from when I started. When I started, it was still a bit of the hometown for celebrities. And there's certainly plenty of famous people and influential people from throughout the world that live there. But you don't see them all hanging out downtown like you did all the way up into like the late 90s, where I write in the book, I'd go to a school board meeting and I'd see Valerie Harper. I'd go to a city council meeting and I'd see Jack Lemmon to complain about his neighbor doing something he didn't like. And I loved that. That was great. I don't think you see it as often anymore because celebrities have retreated from that kind of public life as far as the hands-on element of it. So that was also like an interesting thing. And to see where sometimes famous people tried to take advantage of their fame to get the police to lean one way or another in a case. There's something I write about with Sylvester Stallone getting involved in sort of a car chase with the paparazzi, and it turns into a, he said about who crashed their car into who. And then there was a little bit of an attempt to exert some influence on the Beverly Hills Police Department. And it was not a good moment to be doing that. It was near, things like Heidi Fleiss and Menendez part of what caused that rift that I mentioned between the newspaper in town and the police department, because the newspaper sort of sided with Stallone's attorney on a bigger issue. And these things can really, like as things happen in small towns, they turn into big issues in the community. But this is a big issue that you might be reading about in Rhode Island. There's a very surreal quality to all of it that I always found fascinating, and I have to admit, entertaining. And when I found them entertaining, I'm like, these are stories I think that are going to be entertaining to people all around the world.
Do the cops get paid a lot? Why would any cop want to be in that spotlight?
It's been a while since I've been involved in anything where I've been day to day, working on a crime story, something fresh. But what I think was attractive is that they do, because they're a well-funded community, the pay is pretty good by police officer standards in Southern California. I think if you can get in with them, you're making a financially sound decision. But they also have great resources and are willing to experiment because, again, they have the budget. They have cutting edge techniques. They always have. Doing research in different eras of different stories, I'd find little tidbits about how the police officers were further ahead in their equipment and their training than standard for the time periods. Continues on today. They're becoming very well known for their drone crime surveillance program, to the point of using drones to pursue suspects and track them when it's difficult for the police to navigate the streets in traffic-choked Los Angeles. When I was there, they were just starting a intersection traffic surveillance system with red light cameras and things. Now there are thousands and thousands of cameras in the city that the police have access to. It's going to be something that sparks new laws and new legislations, but these guys are on the frontier. They have cutting edge techniques like Krav Maga has become widely regarded as a great self-defense system without having to know a lot of technique. It relies on your instincts. Beverly Hills Police took that on early. They were doing that in the 80s. And they get to do crazy fun things. There was a period where they used to use the backlot at Universal, the city streets that Universal uses for movie sets, to train for urban combat. If something really terroristically bad happened in the city, they could train there and learn how to operate in a cityscape without disrupting the actual city. If you're a true believer in being a law enforcement officer, you get to do a lot of really right on the edge stuff. And having gone out with the cops on many occasions when I was actively doing it, going out on ride-alongs, undercover things, is fun. It's scary, but it's fun.
So about the cases, what was your favorite case to research and write about?
There's a couple. There's one that didn't make the book, but it was literally like every new door opened 10 new doors of crazy. I thought I knew the story pretty well. It was a story about a mansion on the Sunset Strip that had a series of nude statues that were painted to be anatomically correct. And it was an eyesore beyond. Like, the neighbors hated it. It was in the best section of the city, the most visible section of the city's wealthiest residents, and they hated it. And it was this very young Saudi sheik. You can see the house in the movie The Jerk. It's the house used for Steve Martin's character. And they didn't virtually nothing to make that house look ludicrous. It already looked inside. It looked ludicrous inside.
Are you serious?
Everything you see in that movie, The Jerk, almost everything in there was authentically there before they.
I just thought they were being extreme.
That was the house. That story. I thought I knew it pretty well. Everything was crazy upon crazy because the house burned down. It was arson. Everybody thought the neighbors did it because it was so ugly. The sheik hadn't lived there for a while. Then it turned into, oh no, the arson was actually done to cover up a crime. And then you find out that the person who was involved in the crime was one of the leading plastic surgeons of that period. And then, then there's a big divorce drama between the sheik and his wife, and she's living on the half burned down property because it's the only way she's going to be able to claim it in the divorce. It was just one crazy thing. The sheik ended up being friends with Saddam Hussein and backing him in the Gulf War. It just turned into too long a story for this particular book.
Yeah, that's a book on its own.
In the book, probably the story of Gerard Dennis, the cat burglar, because it's so unknown, but it's so in the thick of a lot of different moments in time. And the fact that, like a lot of stories, even this unknown one ended up having a Hollywood trajectory, in that this guy who was like this movie star handsome cat burglar operating in with impunity in Beverly Hills, Bel Air, Holmby Hills, one of the most successful guys doing this kind of burglary because he fit in with the crowd. He could get into the houses. He was charming. He was handsome. He could pass himself off as a wannabe actor or, somebody who was already wealthy and mix and mingled at the clubs and get invited back to parties at night and then come back 2 nights later and rob them blind. I mean, this guy was amazing. And when he finally got caught, when it was legal to still do something like this, he sold his story. Warner Brothers bought it and made a movie. And that's how he paid for his criminal defense. You can't do that today, but he did. And it's not a great movie. It's an interesting movie. It's about 2% true. Finding out the twists and turns of that particular story was truly delightful. When Warner Brothers did a screening of The Great Jewel Robber, the movie they made about his life. They invited the Beverly Hills police chief at a theater in Hollywood. And while they were in watching the movie, the box office of the theater out front got robbed. Those are the things I live for.
That's completely insane.
As I'm sifting through old newspapers looking for these things, and luckily, I had enough breadcrumbs that I didn't have to start from scratch and just I always kind of knew where I was going to find things. But the amount of crime that you see in the newspapers in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, everybody thinks of the good old days. And I'm like, crime was rampant. And so was sensationalized journalism. And so it was all over. Yeah, we glorify and glamorize our pasts, but they're just as crazy then as they are now. And I'd say that too about Hollywood. People think Hollywood is this unique beast and it's always evolving and changing. But I'm like, man, I see these things that would happen. For example, in the case of, Walter Wanger and Joan Bennett and Jennings Lang, Walter Wanger was a very successful producer whose career had hit the skids pretty hard. His wife was still doing okay. She was a glamorous actress. She was maturing into roles of motherhood type roles, but she was unhappy in the marriage and started cheating with her agent. And that dynamic of producer, actor, agent, always at the threshold of collapse is still very prevalent today. And the fact that once Wanger kind of snapped and confronted them in the parking lot of the talent agency and took a shot at the agent, which happened to be right across the street from the Beverly Hills Police Department, I will add, the fact that they immediately turned to their PR people as quickly as they turned to their lawyers. And the PR people were there at the studios. And in Walter Wanger's case, the biggest producers in Hollywood rallied to his defense to raise bail money for him, including Walt Disney. The guy just took a shot at an agent, and Walt Disney's like, here's $500 for your defense. That's the kind of thing that would happen tomorrow. It's shocking that it is so the same.
I mean, that's interesting because it's kind of like a pattern that hasn't changed much. So in your research, did you notice any kind of common patterns or themes among individuals involved in these crimes and scandals?
That's a good question. In this book, there's really only a couple of instances where the sort of antagonist of the story is a low-level, an average thief. The hostage situation on Rodeo Drive in the 80s was definitely one of those. He clearly had mental issues, but he was not especially smart, charming, handsome, good-looking, clever, just ended up creating a very horrible situation. But a lot of the people, whether good or bad, that get in trouble despite the fact that they're very smart. And they either had resources, had big resources, could have if they applied themselves to a life of, living on the straight and narrow rather than easier paths. That is definitely, to me, a Beverly Hills kind of criminal. Somebody who could have succeeded on their own merits or did succeed on their own merits and got in their own way. There's a lot of that.
I wonder if it's related to power and ego, and at some point you're just, I can do what I want.
I really think that you get conditioned to it, to whatever your level of privilege is. And sometimes that's what your nature is. Sometimes you're looking to be enabled in those ways and looking for every little piece of wiggle room you can take to get ahead. Other times you just get used to it. I can say I don't have a ton of privilege being an entertainment journalist, but I come with some of them. And I've certainly gotten used to things, and I kind of have to stop myself and say, oh yeah, I'm only special in certain contexts. And I don't have a bunch of wealth to insulate me and make me want to believe, well, no, I am special. So there's that. And then I think too, it depends on, in the case of Winona Ryder. Winona was having a lot of emotional trouble dealing with the level of fame that she had achieved and was very open about that. And she was also having some trouble managing pain from an injury that led her to down a road of self-medication in a very unsavory kind of way. And I think that put her at this big inflection point where she made some decisions that were circumstances different she wouldn't have made. But she was in a real difficult place in her life, despite seeming to have everything. And, I kind of say, like, my mental tagline for this book is, when you have everything, you have everything to lose. And she was put in that position. I mean, it was in the big picture of things, it was a relatively minor infraction, but because she was very famous and seemed to have it all and did something against the law for reasons that were really hard for people to understand why, and then fought it very publicly. She put everything on the line. She put her whole career on the line. And to her credit, once she was through that gauntlet, she didn't win, but she did win in that she managed to put her life back together, turn it around, reclaim her career. I think it's safe to say the Beetlejuice sequel is going to be one of the biggest hits of the year. And she's had Stranger Things for the last several years. I'm like, most people don't come back from a big trial like that, especially one that they lose. But she did. And so in some ways you're like, maybe she is special. Maybe she's got something the rest of us don't have.
She's one of the few celebrities that is still alive from the cases that you talk about in your book. How did you decide how much information to include? Just because, with the crimes about old Hollywood and people who are not alive, it's maybe easier to include intimate details, or maybe not. How did you decide how much and what to include?
I mean, so much of it is documented. I didn't really have the luxury of space for an elaborate bibliography, or an index in the book because of all the references, but everything's pretty meticulously, there's sources for everything that's in there. And in the case of Winona, she's been an open book about a lot of her life. So most of that had been reported on in one way or another. And then in that particular story, I was also there for a lot of the public-facing trial. So I had my own vantage point to rely on, having my own experience with it. I kind of say, like, it's my story too, in some ways, which was weird being a character in a story I was writing. That was a new experience. But again, so much of it was out there in different ways. In court documents, in reporting, in her own words. So I wasn't too worried. And I think, I feel like I was pretty fair in all of the stories where if something was alleged or a legend that had popped up or a myth, I presented as such. Going back to the Greystone case, there's a long enduring element of that story. And to give your listeners some context, it's basically the Ned Doheny, who was the heir to Edward Doheny, who was the biggest oil man of his day, the wealthiest man in Los Angeles, one of the wealthiest men in the country in the 1920s. His son Ned had this home, Greystone Mansion, built specifically for him and his family by his father to be the showplace estate of Beverly Hills. As grand a mansion, maybe number 2 after San Simeon and Hearst Castle. And one evening, his closest friend and personal secretary, Hugh Plunkett, arrived at the mansion. They'd had a meeting earlier. There'd been some mounting tensions between the family and Hugh related to a big political scandal known as the Teapot Dome, which I explain is very complex, but I explained it in the book. And as a result, after going to a private study to hash this out, both men ended up dead. Somebody shot somebody and then killed themselves. But who did it to who? That is the lingering question. The official answer is that Hugh cracked under the pressure of this big scandal in a looming court case and shot Ned and then killed himself. There's plenty of forensic evidence to suggest that things happened in exactly the reverse. But on top of that, what's endured over many, many decades is the idea that perhaps the motivating factor was that they were because they were known to be so close. There was a relationship between the two men, an LGBTQ relationship between the two men that was hidden from the public. And there's lots of reasons why that could be. There's little things that might point to that. And it was definitely something that was brought out in the gay press at the time, which was actually more prominent than you might think in the 1920s. There was plenty of it in Los Angeles. So I've always heard this as part of the story of Ned and Hugh and what may have been the reason for this double killing. But I can't find anything concrete that says this was what the real story was. Now I've heard it told that way many times, and in print it's presented that way. But I can't commit to that narrative because I can't prove it. I can only go with what sources have set. And that's probably what makes that story the most interesting, is the political scandal and then the interpersonal question marks and the reasons why that might be true. It adds to the mystique of it all, which is, for me in the writing, part of the fun and cracking the code of what is this story. But I didn't want to decide this is what I want the reader to believe. I only can go off of what I know. And I guarantee you, I've reported all these stories through the lens of time as best I can, but I'm almost certain that something will come up in one of these stories that will prove something not quite perfect in this depiction. And I just have to be prepared for it. I found something right before we went to press. It was just a little detail. It didn't prove anything wrong. I was just able to make it that much more right. And I found it by random circumstance during my proofreading period. So I got to slide it in. It's a minor detail, but that stuff's going to I know it's just going to keep happening.
As time goes on, you find more and more little tidbits of information, and then things become more clear with all these stories. For me, the Greystone one, I think, is the most fascinating one. I really did not connect like Teapot Dome to this ever. That was a shocker for me.
The postscript of it, with Raymond Chandler telling a version of what he thought happened that night in his book, The High Window, because he knew he got to meet Leslie White, the investigator on the case, who told him what he thought happened and wrote about it in his book, his own memoir. Like that whole pulp novelist postscript to the story, I just thought was irresistible. I thought that was like, how perfect.
Yeah. Some of these stories, especially the more recent cases, are, a bit more delicate maybe to navigate, right? Because you have to kind of maintain a relationship and not kind of cross a particular line. I guess, how do you straddle that line?
That's a good question too. I think it's just making an attempt to be fair. There are probably, much shorter, compact versions of these that I've written as newspaper articles back in the day, where I was maybe more quick to judge or even subtly apply my judgment to a person in one of these stories, or what I thought the story was about. And I really tried to take an effort to step back, especially from the stories I thought I knew best, look at them again and try not to prejudge, even if I thought somebody was not a great person. And I might still think that, but I didn't want to oversell it if it wasn't so apparent. Even with Stephen Lividitis, who's still alive, who's still on death row from the Rodeo Drive hostage situation. It's clear that he had some deep traumatizing mental issues going on. But what he did was pretty evil too. So it's hard to reconcile the two things, but you at least want to put the information out so that you can have a better understanding, at least. Even if it ultimately doesn't all add up, you at least see what the journey was. It's tricky because, I think we all want to hear a good, morality story. I have nothing but a weird admiration for Gerard Graham Dennis, for how clever he was as a cat burglar. But what he was doing every day, what his whole life revolved around, was robbing people. So I don't want to put him on a pedestal, but I do have to acknowledge he was very good at it.
What about situations where you mentioned before being in a courtroom, right? And maybe even having spoken to these people prior to this, and now they're on trial. What is that even like?
Yeah, that's interesting. It was always so interesting to have something come alive in front of me, like the chapter titled Charade, which is a lot of my own personal experiences covering different cases. That's a lot like just being a police and crime reporter in any other area, except the stories are weird and occasionally the victims or the criminals are famous. But you end up in a courtroom and you build up in your head before you ever see them or meet them, like what the story, what they're like, what you know about them. And in some cases, I really tried to find, as best I could with limited time, as much detail about these people as I could. But then there's the people that are famous, that are out there that I have encountered when something has gone awry, or when just a workaday cop I know is all of a sudden at the center of a big, huge investigation. Or you meet somebody, like I got to know Les Zoller, who was the principal investigator on the Menendez brothers case. I got to know him pretty well just working my regular job for several years. And to see him as both an incredibly shrewd detective and also just a guy I knew. Famous people, I've been doing my entertainment job long enough that in some ways that's the case too. A lot of them are just people I know. They're very, very famous people I know, but they're people I know. So it's I can look at them a little differently. Then there's one case I was curious and I didn't get to do it because I didn't have the room, but I want to write this story. It's a story about a film industry publicist. She specialized in awards campaigns, Oscar awards campaigns, and she was murdered in 2010. And I didn't know her well, but I knew who she was, but I happened to see her the night that she was murdered, a few hours before she was killed at a film premiere. And I know a lot of people who know her like very well. And she's not famous, like a movie star famous person, but she had a reputation in the industry. And there's still a lot of mystery involving that case. And because I didn't work on it directly when it happened, I just happened to see her that night at a premiere. And I was really interested in how to go about untangling that story as best I could, knowing people and knowing and dealing with them professionally quite often, how that was going to go. But I didn't even get a chance to like start that one. That was one that had to get cut for space. And I want to get back to it. And if I do, I'll report that experience back to you.
It's really interesting that you come from the media world. So how do you think that your industry, your world has had an impact on how people view crime in Beverly Hills? And has it changed over time?
There's always been, as I mentioned, that kind of intrigue to a story coming out of that community because it has such an iconic reputation and it has such a very specifically defined image as the city of glamour and wealth. That's why there's all these great stories from all these different time periods. The 90s really hammered it home with the Menendez brothers and Heidi Fleiss, and then the various Hollywood-related, the OJ, all of those crimes and scandals that were happening really, it gave birth to a whole subset of reporting, like where outlets were dedicated to it and thrived on it. TMZ, The Smoking Gun. There was a TV show called Celebrity Justice. That's how rabid the appetite was for those kinds of stories. That appetite got stoked because the media stoked it. They saw that there was an interest and they're like, oh, you want a nibble? Here's a feast. That endured. I think a spinoff of that, I talk about it a little bit in the book, as a spinoff of kind of the Winona Ryder situation, was like in the 2000s, we saw this laser focused interest in Paris Hilton and Lindsay Lohan and Britney Spears and all these young women with, these enviable on the surface lives, and then getting into trouble, finding some kind of, situation that they probably shouldn't have gotten themselves into. And audiences sort of live. There's always going to be this phenomenon of like, oh, I love that person. They're fabulous. And then you start to get a little worn out of how fabulous they are. And then they get in trouble. And you're sort of be able to vicariously go, see, it's not so great being them. It's not so great being rich and beautiful and famous all the time. My life's pretty good. And then you also get the fun of their comeback. If they're able to successfully turn things around, you get to root for them all over again. And like, that's just storytelling. It's somebody's life on one hand, but it's storytelling that we eat up. What's changed is that celebrities in the advent of the cell phone era and the camera phone era have gotten much more private, much more protective of what they do in the public eye, how they're perceived in the public eye, putting themselves in situations that are hard to get out of. So things tend to be a lot more serious. Let's say Alec Baldwin's trial. That was a very serious situation that he had to deal with and made for a fascinating story. But you don't get the crazy that was going on in the 90s and the 2000s at the level that it was. What that's been replaced by, I think, is this now insatiable appetite for true crime from everywhere. And it might not be Beverly Hills, but if it's a equivalent community outside of Detroit or in Oregon, like anything that's got a juicy hook is now the story. I think if you look at I've been working with People magazine for 17 years, and while they still want good celebrity dish, it's really been superseded by true crime. That has become a really vital part of the magazine's sort of ecosystem, and audiences don't seem to be tiring of that at all. This has been going on for at least a decade. Whatever is torn from the headline kind of crimes. So I think in some ways, celebrity crime stoked the appetite for all of that kind of stuff, as long as it's got a kind of sensational hook. Meanwhile, celebrity crime has dipped down a little bit because they've gotten better about being under the radar. And now you're having things turn out like Harvey Weinstein. This guy was committing crimes left and right for years, but it wasn't until one day it seemed like the bandage got ripped off and everything came out, much to the credit of the people who finally were able to tell their stories.
That's so true about the true crime thing. So if
Yeah.
you're a celebrity, you must be like, oh my God, thank God for that, because they don't have to focus on my life.
Well, yeah, and it used to be 20 years ago, 15 years ago, you could go to every nightclub in town, every good nightclub had a night. Monday night it was go here, Tuesday night it was go there. And the celebrities in their 20s, early 30s all kind of to the same places, most on the specific nights of the week. And it made it really easy for like gossip reporting. Outlets could slide a reporter in there as looking like just another club kid and just see who was talking to who, find out these romances that were like burgeoning under the radar, see who threw a drink in somebody's face. And it was very common. Now it's all very, very behind closed doors. There's a couple of clubs where you might see some celebrities, but it's just as random as if you might see them in a movie theater. Even the Golden Globes, which was legendary for its after parties, all the parties were in the Beverly Hilton. In a different area of the Beverly Hilton Hotel after the show, because that's where the show took place. And they were star-studded parties. I covered InStyle's party for probably 6 years, for 4 of them.
Wow.
And had like my own like complete access. And it was wall to wall, A-list, all lists, celebrities. And now if you cover the Golden Globes, there's no party like that. The people that come are the people who sponsored Netflix's party. You know what I mean? Like whoever the liquor sponsors are. And they're partying at the agencies. They're partying at private mansions now. And it's taken a lot of the fun, to be honest, of those big nights. Because like everything was like in this big epicenter. And now you like kind of like, this is just for the corporate people. Where's the real action?
It's funny though, because I feel like a party scene in general is very different from what it was in the 90s and early 2000s to now. It's very, even the club scene, I'm too old for clubs now at this point, but it's just not something people are doing. The culture has shifted. It's just not there. It'll shift back. Another generation or two, go nuts again. I hear the grandkids say, well, ever going to the club? Like, wow, that's awesome. Because it's just like lost.
What's funny too is to hear people my age. I'm a Gen Xer, and hear celebrities talk about the good old days of like, man, I did some stupid shit in my 20s, and I'm so glad that not everybody in the room had a camera phone. Because you were able to make mistakes. I think anybody that lived through their 20s knew what it was like to go out and do, have a few nights in your life where you made real errors in judgment.
Yes.
But you were allowed to learn from it and not be branded with it beyond like maybe a small subset of your community. But now people have to carry this thing digitally with them on their backs for the rest of their lives.
Because there was no social media. Now it's everywhere and the internet is forever. So you can't escape it if you do something.
The other thing too that, I don't quite get into an era in my book where social media plays a big factor. But that is something where now they really famous people have a direct line to their fan base and can spin their narrative directly to them. And they're not so beholden to the media outlets and how the media outlets decide to portray the narrative or emulate how this other media outlet portrayed the narrative. Like, it's a great leveler, but it's also a great way for somebody to obfuscate what they actually did. Crime has been so down until recently in LA, and particularly in Beverly Hills. There's been a couple juicy things in the last like 2 weeks. Still not big celebrity things, but like crime is a bit on the rise in LA, and it feels very similar to the way it was in the mid 90s, early 2000s. But as far as like big dramatic cases out of Beverly Hills, the last decade or so, there really hasn't been any. Not since the publicity person that I mentioned, Ronnie Chasen. Not since her murder has there been anything really, really dynamic in terms of a juicy story, which as far as public safety goes, great. That's what Beverly Hills Police Department wants. But me as a storyteller about crimes in Beverly Hills, I'm like, I'm ready for one. I'm ready for a new story.
While you were writing the book, were there any moments that completely changed your perspective of Beverly Hills? I mean, obviously you mentioned, O.J. Simpson, and that's kind of your like foray, your beginning, right? And understanding crime in Beverly Hills. But is there anything since the book?
I'm going to give you a surprising answer, and that is no. But I'll tell you why. My perception was immediately, I already came in with like the big booming 80s, 90s perception of Beverly Hills, and then got intimately involved in the small townness of it. Saw how the schools worked, saw how the police worked, how the Chamber of Commerce worked, how the Parks Department worked. I already walked into telling these stories with a pretty firm grip on the infrastructure of Beverly Hills, the community, as opposed to Beverly Hills, the iconic city of movie stars. So in that respect, I think that'll be a surprising element to readers, but it's something that I was very familiar with going in, and probably to the interconnectedness of it all. The fact that the Hollywood sort of intersection, the Venn diagram of Hollywood, big business, crime, and community. The story I did about the lady who was embezzling money from her clients at one of the local banks, and then hired a hitman to eliminate one of the clients she suspected was going to get wise to her and expose her. That's a crazy story in and of itself. But the fact that one of her victims in the embezzling scheme happened to be Little Richard is just so Beverly Hills, because he was just another guy with money in the bank on one level in Beverly Hills, but he was Little Richard. And I love that. I think that kind of stuff that's what makes it an only in Beverly Hills kind of story.
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of learn that, yes, these are celebrities, but they're also still people, and they can be victims as well as criminals and perpetrators. I don't know, I feel like it's kind of humanizing, even your book. Yes, they're celebrities, but it still kind of reinforces the fact that they are people.
One like that, too, is the story with Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin getting in a brawl in the ritziest bar room in Beverly Hills with a couple of other millionaires. And it's like, I deify the Rat Pack. I have been a Rat Pack aficionado for many, many decades now. But that's such a nitty gritty story of like being caught in a moment, even though you're two of the most famous men on the planet at that point, but you get in a heated moment and something happens, and then all of a sudden it takes kind of a scary turn, and it's like, well, you guys probably didn't need to raise the temperature that high, but then what would I have done in the same situation? Maybe would have ended up in the same place. But then now as I said before, when you have it all, you've got it all to lose, and they had to sweat it out in the aftermath of that to see how this was going to play out and what kind of damage it might do to their careers or their lives or their freedom. This is Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin, of all people. That's the thing. They're at the end of the day, they're human beings caught in a moment. You want to see how the moment works out.
It seems like if you're a celebrity at that level, the public has a license to their life, which is completely misconstrued. That's not true, but that's just what it seems like. Who would you want to meet from any of the cases in your book, or even maybe not a case that made it into the book, but you've heard of and you're like, I need to meet one of these people?
Well, historically, I mean, Sinatra and Dean Martin. And weirdly, I mean, Sinatra is like one of the greatest entertainers of all time, period, no argument, full stop. But Dean Martin, to me, is such a fascinating character in and of himself, and seems more my speed. So I'd be very, if I could travel back in time, the first thing I would do is go to Las Vegas circa 1962 and check out a show at the Sands, just for my own satisfaction. But I'd like to meet him. In terms of the law, I'm fascinated by Clinton Anderson, who was the chief of police for many, many, many years and set the tone for how Beverly Hills enforced its laws and protected its own, and would literally, my boss, when I worked at the newspaper, the publisher, who was quite a character, very colorful character in and of himself, told me a story of how he wrote something about the chief of police negative regarding a story. The paper was pretty fresh out of the gate. It was maybe a year old at the time. And the publisher was spending a lot of nights sleeping at the newspaper because he was putting so much blood, sweat, and tears into making it a go. And the chief, after he'd written this negative thing, the chief found out about it, had him arrested, had him driven to the city limits and told, don't come back until you can be a law-abiding citizen. And with Chief Anderson, he's a guy that you took it seriously. Like, he was so intimidating, and like his men revered him and kind of hated him. Men and women, I should say, because they were early, adopters of police women in their ranks. But anyway, He was so tough as nails. There's a legend. I wrote about it a little bit in the hostage situation chapter, where he was reported to have just walked up when somebody was barricaded in a room at the Beverly Hilton Hotel, and the officers had been negotiating, trying to figure out what to do to get this guy out of there for a while. The chief showed up, basically walked in, snatched the gun out of his hand, tossed it to one of his officers, and said, "Arrest this man."
That's wild.
And yet he was like arch conservative. He was on the wrong side of, the anti-communist paranoia of the period. So I'm fascinated by him because he really defined for decades what policing in Beverly Hills was supposed to be. And in his absence, the police struggled with leadership because his was so particular. And even though the department had sort of like outgrown him and he had become outdated by the late 60s, they had a hard time finding leadership that satisfied both the ranks and the people of Beverly Hills that expected a certain kind of protection. So I find him to be probably the most fascinating character consistently through a bunch of the stories. But still, Dean Martin.
I can understand the Dean Martin thing. Yeah.
What would you ask them?
That's a good one. See, the thing is with Dean was, from everything I've heard, and I've spoken before with his daughters. His granddaughters was an acquaintance of mine before I even knew she was his granddaughter. So I've gotten to have some conversations with a couple of his daughters and get a sense. But he seems like he was a really fun man to be around. He was, everybody that I know that knew him speaks very highly of him as just a good presence to be in the company with. But he was a very superficial to the depths of his feelings, connecting. He was an aloof person, even though he had a charm. And so when you deal with people like that, that's difficult to ask them questions when they're probably going to dance around it. If you want to know substantial stuff, I mean, I'd like to know, what were Dean Martin's favorite movies? Who did he like to listen to sing? But that conversation only goes so long. I mean, I would like to ask him exactly what the hell happened in the Polo Lounge on his birthday in 1966, because that's still kind of muddy. And then with the chief, I'd like to know how much of it was posture, how much of it was the way he thought he had to be, because that's what the culture, that's what the specific Beverly Hills location demanded, and how much of it was just who he was and the way he thought things were supposed to be. That's always, with somebody in that kind of authority, I'm always curious about that relationship. Are you being who you think you need to be, or are you being who you believe you're supposed to be?
I don't know. I think that's actually a really good question for that would be a good question for the chief, because then it just kind of helps with the mindset of, all right, you're running this department, expectations of officers, and just kind of how to interact with the citizens of Beverly Hills, like how delicate those situations are.
The chief who was in charge when I was in the thick of it with police reporting was a man named Marvin Iannone, and he was the antidote to all the leadership problems that Beverly Police had in between Chief Anderson and him. He came from LAPD. He was, top ranking. He had an interesting backstory. He was one of the first officers on the scene when Marilyn Monroe was found dead, and had worked up the ranks from patrol all the way up to the highest echelons, and then realized he was second in line to get the LAPD chief's position and wasn't going to get it. Daryl Gates had staked it out and was most likely going to get it. So he pivoted over to Beverly Hills, and he brought a real knowledge and organizational skill and forward-thinking ideas to that department, and also was a great interface between the community and the department, because he understood in a way that was hard for a lot of people. He understood the population of Beverly Hills.
Right.
It isn't all rich people, to be fair. I mean, a huge swath of that city, which isn't that big, is mansions and very wealthy people. But there's a lot of workaday people. The city swells during the day with people who come in to do their job and go home to somewhere else, but are part of the community. When I was there, I didn't live in Beverly Hills, still don't. But, the people who are in charge of how the community feels need to feel heard. The chief was both great at doing that, but also keeping them at a distance that they weren't meddling and protecting his own, but not to the degree that, like, if somebody screwed up in the department, that they weren't gonna face consequences. I liked his fairness, and I had seen what the department had become in his wake, and it was a really interesting department to write about at the time. He was an interesting guy. I got a couple of good audiences with him. He was always a good conversation.
So it really does take a specific type of person to fill that role of the chief of Beverly Hills. Yeah.
In the 70s, they struggled a little bit with bringing in people from the outside that were very forward thinking for the time when it was this big generational shift. But Beverly Hills was also an old-fashioned town run by financially successful people, and they didn't necessarily want police chief that was going to be understanding of the hippies, and so they didn't work out. And then they tried some promotion from below, somebody who'd risen through the ranks, and that worked out better. They still needed to fine tune it, and getting a chief like Marva Iannone was somebody who had been at the top ranks of a very a very adjacent department that knew the region very well and knew the different strata and knew specifically what the strata was that inhabited Beverly Hills. It's fascinating. I love meeting the people at the time, the different people who were active in the community. Some people lived in apartments at the very edge of the south edge of the city, simply for the fact that they wanted their kids to go to Beverly Hills High School because they knew they'd get a quality public education there.
Yeah.
And have opportunities. They'd make friends that could open up doors. People like Nicolas Cage went to Beverly Hills High. Angelina Jolie went to Beverly Hills High. Like, they were part of famous families, but not so famous that they didn't have to go to public school. But these people made friendships. I still see people that have friendships that have lasted for decades because they were part of that unique, the original 90210 high schoolers.
That's awesome. This was great. Once again, really enjoyed the book.
Thanks.
It's great.
Thanks for finding me. I'm glad you guys found me.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
yes.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Great.
We'd like to thank Scott for being on the show with us today and for taking us on a tour of the dark side of Beverly Hills. Make sure you pre-order your copy of Scott's book, Beverly Hills Noir: Crime, Sin, and Scandal in 90210, so you have it by October 1st. You can find the link to order the book on the episode page on our website.
Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Bound by the Cloak. You can follow us on social media, and you can get us wherever it is that you get your podcasts, whether that's Apple, Spotify, Good Pods, we're everywhere. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode. Thanks for listening.
Until next time.